all to this session of our virtual conference, which is part of our John Howard Society Week activities. Today, the virtual conference will focus on institutional corrections issues, and we're very excited about this panel. We think it'll be very interesting. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get into it. One is that the cameras and microphones will be off. And at the end of the session, there will be an opportunity for people participating in breakout sessions in order to get more feedback and suggestions from the participants. If you can join us for that, please just don't leave after the first hour. And Ria, through her magic, will distribute us into small groups so that the discussion can continue. This will be, the PowerPoint will be distributed to you after the event, and this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to refer back to it at any point. At this point, it is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, who's Pierre Hawkins. He is counsel for the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan, and he is awaiting the decision of the Supreme Court in his efforts to give some due process protections and rights to provincial prisoners. So, Pierre, thank you very much for joining us, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I want to thank everyone at the John Howard Society of Canada for putting together these sessions. I know they've been very insightful so far and very well attended, and I've been looking forward to this one for weeks. So thank you so much, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. Our presenters today are titans in the field of prison reform. We are going to start with 15 minutes for each presenter, and then I'd ask that if you can, you stick around for a half hour afterwards for the breakout sessions where we can discuss some of the issues that are brought up in today's session. So we are going to hear today from Howard Sapers, from John Chafe, and from Jen Metcalf. I'll give them each a brief introduction when their turn comes up, but I'd ask that you please take a look at their full bios in the email sent out yesterday with the Teams link. They've all got spent incredible careers, and they've all got incredible bios, and I'd ask that you please take a look if you have time. So without further ado, we'll start with Howard Sapers. Howard has spent a lifetime of public service in elected office as a policy advisor, as a scholar, and as an ombudsman, and much more. He's spent over a decade as the Correctional Investigator of Canada. Again, I'd ask that you take a look at his bio. It's really impressive. Howard is going to talk to us about the elimination of segregation and the promise of structured intervention units. So please save your questions either in the chat or wait until after the three presenters have come up. There'll be a bit of there'll be a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll move to the breakout session. So without further ado, a man who needs little introduction in these circles, Howard Sapers.
Howard, you're muted.
There, it's working. For whatever reason, it's not sharing my slides. Are you seeing them now? You got it? Okay.
Yes.
All right, let me just get it into the presentation mode. So to all of you in the audience, we actually did a dry run and it worked fine a minute ago, so it's just me that I broke it again. Hello, everybody. Congratulations to the John Howard Society for putting this week-long series together. It's terrific. I am speaking to you from my home in Ottawa, which is on unceded Algonquin territory, and where I do my work, always mindful of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. I have a PowerPoint that's got more slides than I have time for, so I'm going to be skipping the first few, but you will be able to see the entire presentation. I understand it's going to be shared with all the participants. Much of this, the first few slides are boilerplate that I think you're probably all familiar with anyway. Bill C-83, which was a response to a couple of Court of Appeal decisions. And then when C-83 was actually proclaimed into force, the Minister of Public Safety created something called the Structured Intervention Unit Implementation Advisory Panel. There were two versions of this panel. My presentation will be dealing with the panel that was established in the spring of 2021 and carried on for 3 years to the end of December of 2024. Won't bother describing the structured intervention units, but I will say that the Correctional Service of Canada has some interesting definitions around what a structured intervention unit was supposed to be, hence the title of the presentation about the promise of structured intervention. This placemat is interesting for many reasons, maybe even remarkable, but a couple of things I'm just going to point out is that in at least two places in this this image, which is supposed to capture everything that a structured intervention unit was meant to be, it refers to them as transformational and historic. And they were transformational, according to the Correctional Service of Canada, because they adopted a positive intervention-based approach to address individual prisoner needs. Now, I thought after reading the CCRA and looking at commissioners' directives, I thought that was the way corrections was supposed to be run. So I started scratching my head immediately when I read that about what was going to be transformational about these things called structured intervention units. And if you look at the rest of this placemat, you'll see that SIUs are similar to regular cells, that people are supposed to get access to programs and interventions, but nowhere does it actually operationalize what the structured intervention part, what the new or transformational part of this policy initiative was going to be. And I think that actually is really instructional to sort of understand why things didn't work out quite the way I think the courts were hoping, or that CSC had told Parliament they would work out. So in a nutshell, to respond to the Court of Appeal decisions in Ontario and British Columbia, time in an SIU would replace what otherwise might have been time in a segregation cell. It would be a last resort. They'd be subject to decisions to transfer somebody, would be subject to independent external oversight, and this oversight body would have the authority to order prisoners transferred out of those SIUs. A prisoner was supposed to spend a minimum of 4 hours unlocked and outside of a cell, and at least 2 of those hours would involve something called meaningful human contact or interaction. The stay in the SIU was meant to be brief and was not supposed to normally exceed 15 continuous days. Obviously, that's benchmarked against what becomes prolonged stay in isolation according to the Mandela rules. And that special attention would be paid to those prisoners who were of Indigenous heritage and those who had mental health concerns or disorders. When the SIUs were established, they were established based on some kind of weird math that I've never been able to figure out. There are 15 structured intervention units across the country, 1 in each of the women's centers. And then the remaining 10 distributed across the 5 operational regions with very little coherence. And if you take a look at the far right-hand column, you'll see we did a calculation of prisoner cells, SIU cells per 100,000 rated capacity of that region. And you see that rate varies dramatically. In Ontario, there's only 1 male SIU, 1 female SIU, and they have one of the largest populations of any of the regions. They have a rate of 13.4, so 13 and a half SIU cells per 1,000 rated capacity. But that varies so dramatically. You can see the prairies, it's almost 3 times as high, over 36 per 100,000. In fact, what happened is that the SIU capacity was established roughly speaking, based on what the experience of the utilization of segregation was. So again, you're seeing that it's not really a clear break from seg. And to punctuate that point, most of the SIUs, in fact, were operationalized in the just recently emptied segregation units. So it's not unusual to go into an institution and still see signs in the hallways saying, segregation this way, or even staff and prisoners talking about SEG as opposed to SIU, because for many of the people that have been around a long time, it looks to them like the same thing. It's in the same place. So the panel had a mandate to advise both the minister and the commissioner of corrections to make recommendations where it was seen necessary. We've issued 3 annual reports over our mandate. We issued a 4th final report to the Minister of Public Safety, which is now available on the Public Safety website. You can see the address at the bottom of the screen. We also issued some other reports. We did some thematic updates around Indigenous prisoners, around mentally disordered prisoners, around the work of the independent external decision makers. We also issued some preliminary observations. So a lot of work came out of that panel over 36 months. And if you're interested in finding out more, please visit that website. They're all posted, at least for the time being, and publicly available. So in the first report, we actually made 41 very detailed recommendations that covered 14 areas of operation. And we thought this is what would be helpful. We thought that both the Correctional Service and the Minister of Public Safety would want to know about how CSC was doing, how the implementation was going, and meeting those promises around time out of cell, meaningful human contact, that stays should be brief, that they should be a last resort, that they were properly staffed, that the needs of mentally disordered prisoners were being addressed, the needs of Indigenous prisoners were being addressed. And so we made a number of recommendations, and they were met with a polite response from the minister and a defensive response, more or less, from the Correctional Service of Canada. And so we had to rethink our approach, which we did in our next annual report, where we only made 3 recommendations. And instead of directing them operationally to the Correctional Service of Canada, we decided to direct them to the Minister of Public Safety. And there are 3 big ideas. Correctional Service must be directed to examine the relationship of the SIUs to the rest of its operations, because it became abundantly clear to us that the amount of attention and the amount of resources that were all directed towards SIUs were having a problematic effect or ripple effect throughout the rest of CSC operations. And we're not sure that the service, the taxpayers, and particularly the prisoners, were getting any benefit from that disproportionate amount of attention. It seemed that a lot of the work was going to generating reports to be able to check off certain to-dos. So for example, prisoners not getting time out of cell was not reported on, but the percentage of prisoners that were offered time out of cell was reported on. So offering time out of cell, which is what is legislatively required, became the proxy for failure or success. Didn't matter whether people actually got out of their cell, but as long as they were offered time out of cell, CSC was reporting mission accomplished. The second recommendation was that CSC must be directed to develop and implement a plan to reduce the overrepresentation of Black prisoners, Indigenous prisoners, and mentally disordered prisoners. So the same pressure points that we saw with the use of segregation in terms of it having a disproportionate impact on identifiable populations within the prisoner population overall was happening again in SIUs. And they were also disproportionately spending longer in those SIUs once they were transferred in. And thirdly, we said CSC must be directed by the minister to ensure that all prisoners for more than 15 days will have their case referred to an independent external decision maker, this legislatively created oversight and review body. And you may be curious about the last phrase in that sentence that says, regardless of whether or not the prisoner had been previously ordered released. That's because there's a little glitch in the system. If the commissioner had already reviewed the transfer and had decided that it was an inappropriate transfer and ordered the institution that had transferred to release that person, then it was considered that that review was done and that person was not referred to an IEDM. So perversely, what the data showed is that somebody who had been reviewed at the earliest opportunity internally, where and a determination had been made to transfer them out, their case was not further reviewed, and those folks tended to languish a very long time before that original order to transfer was actioned. So it not only rendered the IEDMs impotent, but it also demonstrates that there's a big gap between what even headquarters would have seen as a deviation from policy and what was actually happening at the SIU institutions. So we made those 3 recommendations. We were very hopeful that we get some traction. We didn't. In fact, we got a relatively inadequate response. So when we issued our 3rd annual report, which again was very data rich, and I'd commend it to you if you want to get a good idea of what's been happening now over a number of years of operation, we simply repeated the same recommendations. Different minister, so we hope we'd get a little bit more traction. Not really, didn't happen. So we went on to our final report, and surprise, surprise, we made no recommendations. It seemed like they were falling on deaf ears, so we didn't want to waste our breath. So instead, we reported some major conclusions and some directions for the future. And it was all embedded in a lot of data. This is just a couple of snapshots of the data that we reported. What I'd like you to do is look at the first 2 columns, the number of segregation stays while segregation was still in operation, and then those stays of in seg of more than 61 days compared to the number of stays in SIUs over 61 days. And what you see is if you follow that through, that what we have is just as many, if not more, prisoners staying that long in an SIU over 61 days as was happening under segregation. So that whole discussion around length of time and generally speaking should not exceed 15 days or else becomes prolonged, not only becomes prolonged, but when you look forward in the other columns up to more than 120 days, very prolonged stay. So still a lot of people, and in some cases more than those than during segregation, are staying a long time in these structured intervention units. And again, another way of looking at this is that if you look at sort of the bottom row, you'll see 16.9% in what would be considered, according to Mandela, as prolonged stays, more than 15 days. Another 20% very long-term or long-term stays, and then another 22% very long-term. So if you add that up, you get more than half would violate that principle that was supposed to be addressed by trying to ensure that stays stay under 15 days. And again, we see that it's still landing disproportionately on Indigenous and Black and other racialized groups. And if you look at the column that's titled 62 to 769 days, yes, 769 days, more than 2 years in an SIU, you can see the distribution, about 19% for Caucasian, 26% for Black, almost 24% for Indigenous. So again, disproportionate at sort of the worst end, the most disproportionate on the racialized and Indigenous groups. So key findings, I think I must be at time. I'm going to continue to talk without inhaling. SIUs have not eliminated the experience of solitary confinement. CSC will say there's no more solitary confinement, there never was, but many prisoners continue to experience solitary confinement-like conditions. That is, being locked in their cell for more than 20 or 22 hours a day, not having meaningful contact with others, and staying for very long periods of time. Clearly, there's been no transformation in federal corrections. Of importance, the bill that created structured intervention units also had a requirement that a review of the bill must be undertaken by the parliamentary committee at the start of the 5th year after the day in which the section came into force. So after November of 2019, 5 years later, we're past that. There should have been a parliamentary review. Doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. And that's in spite of the fact that, pardon me? Hello?
It's okay, keep going. Sorry, I muted you. Howard, you're muted.
There we go. How's that? Can
Much
you hear me
better,
now?
thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay. What I was saying is that the panel was given a 3rd year of operation to inform that parliamentary review, which didn't happen, still hasn't happened. And there's some other issues that have led us to conclude that the work of the panel is not complete. And while we're not suggesting that the panel per se should be prolonged, I think our work is done in many cases, but reacting to the work, responding to the work, implementing decent responses to the recommendations, etc., that remains undone. And government has said that the Office of the Correctional Investigator will continue that work. Obviously, I have tremendous confidence in that office, but they have a mandate that's very broad for the whole correctional service. The panel had a mandate that was strictly focused on the SIUs. We think it's important enough that some mechanism needs to still exist to put pressure on Canada to do what it needed to do to properly address those court decisions, just to bring everything full circle. And I don't want to leave without saying that nothing has changed. Some things have changed. CSC has taken some actions. They've enhanced the staffing model for the SIUs. They've improved their data collection through a digital portal called the SIU LTE. They've been a little bit more porous with the community, inviting organizations into institutions to see how they could help discharge the mandate of the SIUs a little better. There's been some documentation and sharing of best practices. Most of the capital work is done. There's ongoing efforts to recruit elders, and they've improved some of their data collection. But this is really just nipping around the edges of what needs to happen. The substantive things have not improved over the entire operation of the SIUs. If you want more information, you can contact me directly, or again, I'll direct you to the reports that are available online. And thanks again for inviting me.
Howard, thank you so much for your important work and for telling us about it. Obviously, something that that needs more attention and consideration from a lot of different people. Next up, we've got John Chafe. John spent decades fighting on the inside and the outside for new approaches to corrections in Canada. He is a long-standing resource for and collaborator with the John Howard Society of Canada. Today, he's going to talk to us about the timeliness of program delivery within CSC. Please, a warm welcome to John Chafe.
Thank you, Pierre. Sorry. I don't know if that'll stay there or not. It's clear that program delivery is not happening at appropriate times. We know that the vast majority, roughly 80% of prisoners are not ready for day parole when their day parole date comes. They're either not at the appropriate levels of institutionalization to receive the programs that they require to be released, or they just haven't been given the programs yet that they need. I was the chairman of the John Howard Group in Joyceville Institution for 17 years, and our focus there was pre-release planning, preparing for parole. The reality is that prisoners are not very good at protecting their right for a day parole hearing, an effective day parole hearing. The issue is creating a record of the positive things that they've done, because you cannot count on your parole officer to put forward to the parole board, the releasing board, positive things that you've done. So it's important for prisoners to create their own records and to maintain their records. Part of the problem that we went through was that parole officers would make agreements with prisoners about if the prisoner did X, Y, or Z, then they would be supported by the parole officer for either cascading or admission to some releasing mechanism. And then when the time came, the parole officer would renege on the agreement. So we would have prisoners, when they met with their parole officers, create a record, a transcript of a gist of what was said during the hearing, during the meeting with their parole officer. Now, one of the things that CSE had put into their policy was that you would have case management team meetings. And there would be more than just the prisoner and the parole officer present. These very seldom happened in my experience. So there were no witnesses to what was said. So the prisoner, it's incumbent upon the prisoner to leave the meeting and generate a gist of what was said during the meeting. And there's nothing wrong with sending a copy of that to your parole officer at the time, so that it's in writing. And I mean, if the parole officer has a problem with it, they can object to what you've written at the time. And if they don't object to it, then we could consider it to be a true record of what was said, because that's how they treat us. If we don't object to something that's said at the time, then we can be said to have accepted it. So this is helpful in proving that the prisoner has tried to create the opportunity to participate in programs. Now, in 2023, there was a new guideline that came out for National Correctional Program Management, guideline 726-3. And it talks about record keeping of your correctional plan, which contains within it the programs that CSC expects you to complete to reduce your risk to public safety so that you can be released to the community. And one of the problems that we have is that a large variable within that to be considered by your parole officer is your day parole date. Now, as a lifer, the issue is that, yes, I have a day parole date, but The consideration by CSC is that I'm serving a life sentence, so what does it matter where I serve that sentence? It's difficult to motivate CSC to provide the program in a timely fashion. There's another consideration within that, and that's that if programs actually, cognitive behavioral programs actually reduce our risk to public safety, and there's a mandate within CSC to keep the prisoners safe, then it would only make sense that program delivery should be delivered upon entering the system. We should be given programs designed to release our degree of violence or our triggers, our criminogenic factors in as soon as possible, because this would make for a safer institution. And a safer institution with less stress in it means that prisoners are going to behave more peacefully and more pro-socially, and they're going to be able to cascade faster. Now, for lifers, this would create issues in that we would eventually clog up the camps, the minimum security institutions. And in fact, populations in minimum security institutions are heavily weighted towards lifers anyways. In my experience, the camps had more than 60% were serving a life sentence or an indeterminate sentence. But still, program delivery is critical. And it's clear that CSC is failing in its mandate to provide these programs in a timely fashion. And the speaker yesterday spoke about lack of access to education, lack of access to technology, and lack of access to the programs themselves. The issue is that by denying us access to technology, which everything is considered a program in CSC, we could then cascade faster, but more importantly, we could make career choices, not just job choices, not just to get out and get a minimum wage job, but we could actively engage in, given the amount of time, 10, 20, 30 years inside prison, we have a lot of time, we would have a lot of time to develop a broader knowledge base and to have a true career in whatever field that we chose, provided, of course, that it met other safety concerns, security concerns within the prisons. Can't have a chemistry lab, for example, but there's a lot of other things that we could do. And as was pointed out, universities have moved away from correspondence courses and gone to the internet, which is only reasonable. And yet we are still denied access to the internet in our day-to-day lives within the institution. And there are more than enough safeguards and firewalls these days to protect whatever security concerns a prison has. So to cut us off from post-secondary education is cruel and inhumane. It's demeaning and it denigrates our lives. But more importantly, it impoverishes us and our communities. CSC is not excited about empowering the prisoners. It tends to withhold the cognitive programming that would help them make better decisions until it's absolutely necessary to give it to them before they can be released. And so day parole dates are not what drives program access. Statutory release dates for finite prison sentences tends to drive access, and it makes of lifers second-class citizens in terms of being able to access those programs. So it's a real problem in terms of program access, and I'm not going to belabor the audience with statistics on that. It's very clear that there's systemic problems with access. And the sad part is that if we actually allowed people out, if we gave them what they needed to work on reducing their risk to public safety, and we let them out at their day parole dates, we would save literally hundreds of millions of dollars in imprisonment costs. And if CSC was to take that money and to channel it into the community. So for example, we know that there's a significant percentage of the population that has mental health problems, and that they would benefit from professional mental health support. And if we were to channel some of that money that would be saved by first of all, giving them the support while they're inside, but then being able to release them sooner in their sentence on their day parole dates, then we could channel that money and have professionals associated with the community, CSC, the parole offices in the community, to help them within their daily lives in the community. And that there would be a spillover effect with that those professionals, mental health professionals that were in those communities could also work with the young offenders and with other people to fill out their workload. And the communities would benefit. The towns that people are released to and the cities that people are released to would have access to more mental health funding. And I see that as a positive step. Now, Sherry Gordon has participated in these hearings every day this week, and she clearly has a relationship with someone inside, and she has talked about the problems that whoever she's related to had accessing programs and the fight that goes on with it. Thank you, Rhea. I don't want to belabor the point. I don't have to. I think that anybody associated with the system realizes that there's a systemic failures in providing access. I will say that Shane Martinez, a lawyer in Toronto, and myself hope to proceed with a lawsuit that will address the issue of lifers in particular, because I'm a lifer, not being able to get on their day parole dates. And anybody that's interested in that can contact me or Shane, and we'll be happy to share that, what we're doing with it. More importantly, I would ask that anybody out there that has data or personal experiences and wishes to share them with us, Shane and I would be more than grateful, because it's very difficult to pry the numbers out of CSC. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much for participating. It makes me feel very good and very hopeful for our future, that there are so many who take the time to learn and to try to do something to address the systemic issues that we have. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks for your work and for telling us about something that should really be a central focus of the correctional system, and sadly isn't. Next up, we've got Jen Metcalf. Jen is the Vice President of the Canadian Prison Lawyers Association and a member of the CBA Committee on Imprisonment and Release. Jen served for 16 years at the helm of Prisoners Legal Services in British Columbia and is currently on contract with the BC First Nations Justice Council. Jen's going to talk to us today about reform proposals to address mass incarceration of Indigenous people in Canada. So please, I'll pass you to the formidable Jen Metcalf.
Thank you so much. And it's, such an honor to be a part of this panel today. I'm a settler living and working on the unceded land of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kakite First Nations, colonially known as New Westminster, BC. And this is an issue that is really near and dear to my heart. I've witnessed the impact of prison on so many Indigenous people in prison, and I feel a really deep responsibility to draw attention to what I consider to be a continuation of Canada's genocide against Indigenous people in Canada. In 2003, I wrote a report for Prisoners Legal Services on this issue, and I interviewed about 60 Indigenous people in prison and who work in corrections. The report is called Decarceration Through Self-Determination, Ending the Mass Incarceration of Indigenous People in Canada. And if you're interested, it's on Prisoners Legal Services website, or if you want, I could put my email in the chat and I could send you the link. Today I will just be speaking about two of the main takeaways from that research that I did. Okay, so that's great. Thank you very much. I'm sure that everyone is really familiar with these statistics, but I think they're worth repeating. So 33% of people in prison, federal prisons in Canada, are Indigenous. So about 1/3 of people who represent about 5% of the population in Canada. And then 50% of women in federal prisons in Canada are Indigenous. Indigenous men are twice as likely to be classified to maximum security as other men. And so 51% of men in maximum security are Indigenous. Indigenous women are 3 times as likely to be in maximum security, and almost 70% of women in maximum security are Indigenous. Indigenous people are overrepresented in uses of force. So 39% of CSC's uses of force are against Indigenous people. And I've seen a number of different statistics. So I'm not sure if this one is current, but really high overrepresentation rates of people in SIU. I thought it would be helpful to have some visuals, and this is an image of the emergency response team taking someone down using a shield and a use of force. And uses of force could include tackling someone to the ground, pushing them against a wall, striking them with a hand or knee, manipulating their limbs for what is called pain compliance, using pepper spray or tear gas, using batons, shields, and in some cases, tasers, rubber bullets, and other impact rounds or firearms. Okay, next slide. And this is a solitary confinement cell. And then the next slide. This is an image of Joey Toussaint, who is a client of mine. Joey is Dene, and he's in prison right now at Kent Institution in SIU. He's given permission to talk about his case, and it gives him kind of a sense of able to kind of continue on, to know that there are so many people in the community who care about him and want to see him get out of these circumstances. Joey has spent over 3,000 days in segregation or in SIU, and he's had hundreds of uses of force against him. And so he has all of those normal responses to trauma and isolation. You can see in this photo that his arm is bandaged because he self-harms by cutting. and he's wearing a suicide smock, and so he's in a suicide observation cell. You can see that his cell is very sparse. In suicide observation, people are often denied items that could help occupy their minds, and clothing and bedding. So these are some of the symptoms of trauma that you might expect someone to exhibit who has experienced hundreds of uses of force. So always like being hyper vigilant, always on guard for danger, self-destructive behavior, irritability, angry outbursts, aggressive behavior, negative thoughts about yourself, other people in the world, hopelessness about the future, memory problems, trouble concentrating, difficulty maintaining close relationships, and feeling detached and a lack of interest in activities. And then these are some of the symptoms of solitary confinement that have been recognized by the courts of appeal in Ontario and British Columbia that found the former segregation regime of CSC unconstitutional under Section 7 liberty rights and under Section 12 the right not to be treated with cruelty and unusual punishment. So these symptoms include anxiety, stress, depression, hopelessness, anger, irritability, hostility, panic, worsened pre-existing mental health disabilities, problems with attention, concentration, and memory, paranoia, poor impulse control, social withdrawal, outbursts of violence, and self-harm or suicide. So Joey has experienced all of these. He's almost died from severe self-harm. And, you know, one of them is about self-withdrawal. And so he has a really hard time coming out of his cell to access some of the services that Howard talked about that are offered to people in SIU. He's concerned that if he leaves his cell, he will get beat up by correctional officers, and it's not an unfounded concern because it's happened so many times. He's worried that his cell will be ship bombed. He's worried that guards are ship bombing his food, and so he doesn't eat. And so then CSC says you need to have a meeting with the dietitian to get Ensure, but he can't because he's afraid to leave his cell. And so they just create this environment that is impossible for people to get out of. So the first of the areas for legislative and policy reform that I want to talk about is security classification. So under Section 18 of the Corrections Regulation, Corrections and Conditional Release Regulation, there are 3 criteria for keeping people in different security classifications: risk to public safety, escape risk, and the degree of supervision and control within the penitentiary required, which under policy is referred to as institutional adjustment. So to be held in maximum security, you have to be both a high risk to public safety and a high escape risk, or only requiring a high degree of supervision and control within the penitentiary. So you can be in maximum security without having any concerns about your risk to public safety. Next slide. And so these are some of the criteria under the institutional adjustment policy under Commissioner's Directive 705-7. And so they include very direct instructions to decision makers to give someone a high institutional adjustment rating under grounds of discrimination in human rights law. So one of them is whether the inmate displays special needs or socio-cultural factors indicating a requirement for special interventions on an ongoing basis. And they give the example of Indigenous people and women. Whether the inmate has a history of mental health disabilities, suicidal ideation, self-injury, and for Indigenous offenders, I use in quotes, provide an analysis of their history of mental health concerns, suicidal ideation, and or self-injury within the context of their Indigenous social history. So this is giving instruction for parole officers, despite the legislation requiring institution or Indigenous social history only to be considered in reducing security classification, or it's actually more about risk, so it doesn't technically apply to institutional adjustment. Yeah, it's giving instruction to use Indigenous social history as a sign of higher institutional adjustment, which is just discrimination on its face. And then another one of the criterion is current emotional stability and whether this will impact the inmate's institutional adjustment. And so when you remember those symptoms of solitary and use of force, which people in maximum security are more likely to experience, it just makes it impossible for people to get out of maximum security. And so they continue in this cycle of isolation and violence, and then having those normal, healthy responses to that kind of abuse. So they just can't get out of max. Sorry, can you just go back for 1 sec? So yeah, I think some of the ways that like I think the corrections and conditional release regulation should be amended to remove institutional adjustment as a criterion for security classification, and that legislation and policy should be amended to focus on mitigating risk by meeting people's needs instead of using those needs as a way to keep them in higher levels of security. Thank you. And so the second area that I wanted to talk about is Section 81 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. This provision gives the minister or a person authorized by the minister to enter into an agreement with an Indigenous governing body or an Indigenous organization to provide correctional services to Indigenous people, and for the minister to fund those services. So yeah, this is I'm not recommending reforms to the legislation. I think the legislation is very strong. It includes a nation-to-nation relationship between the Minister of Public Safety and Indigenous governing bodies and organizations. And it includes funding for those services, and it doesn't set any parameters on what those services can look like. So unfortunately, the Minister of Public Safety has delegated this authority to the Correctional Service of Canada, who controls negotiation, implementation, and management of Section 81 agreements. And the policy requires that Section 81 agreement holders must support the spirit of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, the mandate of the Department of Public Safety, and CSC's mission and values and ethics framework, corporate priorities, and strategic plan for Aboriginal corrections. So I would recommend reform to policy where CSC is not responsible for negotiating Section 81 agreements. With the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's really important that these agreements be based on the right to self-determination as informed by Indigenous law. So I think it would be a better model for Indigenous bodies to negotiate Section 81 agreements through the Minister of Public Safety, and to have the autonomy to provide services in accordance with UNDRIP and Indigenous law. And I think this could be done by the minister setting up a body of Indigenous experts on healing and corrections who could take on that role of negotiating agreements with Indigenous bodies and organizations. And so CSC policy also limits access to healing lodges to minimum security or on a case-by-case medium security, which I think only happens in healing lodges designated for women. And so only 15% of Indigenous people are rated as minimum security, as opposed to 36% of white men. And so I would argue that policy should be reformed to give Indigenous Section 81 agreement holders the authority to decide who can access their services, because this eliminates access to anyone who has the highest level of need, like people like Joey who are in maximum security. Thank you. And so Section 81 agreements are like really badly underfunded. There are only six Section 81 agreements. All are in the form of healing lodges, which kind of mirror the structure, like the colonial structure of a prison. And then there are another 4 healing lodges, which are operated by CSC as minimum security prisons. So only 2% of Indigenous people serving custodial sentences are in Indigenous-run healing lodges. And the 6 Section 81 healing lodges receive only 34% of CSC's funding for healing lodges. So the rest goes to the ones that are operated by CSE. And that represents only about 0.4% of CSE's annual budget of approximately $3 billion. So I would recommend that Canada take truth and reconciliation seriously and shift $1 billion from its budget, which represents 1/3 of its annual budget, because 1/3 of people in prison are Indigenous, so that Indigenous communities can establish well-funded, robust alternatives to prison that could also serve people in maximum security and provide intensive healing for solitary confinement and trauma symptoms. I think that's my last slide. Yes. Oh, good. So, oh no, okay, this is my last slide. Sorry. So yeah, and I think people like Joey would do really well in Indigenous operated facilities that are based on ceremony and Indigenous law. So this is an excerpt from one of Joey's elder reviews, and it says, I believe, and it's included in his Glady report. It says, I believe it is important to provide a safe space for him, an element of normalcy and some freedom. We spend time outside walking, we smudge, we pray, and I feed him. Joey is institutionalized. It is a long process of healing and wellness. We undertake elders' teachings and talk about his life. He tells me about how it was for him growing up with his grandfather. I also visit with him when I can on the unit. The elder shared that Joey set up a teepee for the cultural center. She noted the look on his face after that accomplishment was very peaceful. She said he was very proud. He really likes the outdoors, and I believe that being on the land is helpful to him, as is smudging and praying, she said. I saw Joey come alive when we go outside, and I think for him, the land is healing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. I think most of us in this field have seen how the mass incarceration of Indigenous people has affected people like Joey and entire communities. So thank you for your work and thanks for teaching us about this. It's hard to imagine work more important than the work done by our 3 presenters today. And so I want to thank you all 3 of you so much for coming and teaching us about these things, teaching us about possibilities for reform inside and outside of prisons. So thank you very much.